Tucker, 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 Tucker really is an asshole. He's an asshole. He's an asshole. He's an asshole. After 8 seasons consisting of 73 episodes, my watch of Game of Thrones has ended. What the fuck was that?! Howdy, Full Metal Cowboy, straight shooting a review of Game of Thrones Season 8. This is the final season of what could have and should have been the finest show that HBO ever produced, had it been masterfully executed from beginning to end. Had that been the case, Game of Thrones would have been a masterpiece of a television show. But of course, from the early years, that was wishful thinking, because there was one huge concern. Where are those final 2 installments of A Song of Ice and Fire that this show is adapting from? Because it would bring great concern regarding future seasons, seeing as how the last few seasons would definitely not be adapting from the books, but rather adapting an outline that George R.R. Martin provided for David Benioff and D.B. Weiss. There is one thing I still stand by when it comes to Game of Thrones. The first 4 seasons were excellent. The first half of this show is must-see television. But by the time Season 5 came around, that is when the quality of the show changed. I still like that season, even though I didn't find it as excellent as the first 4 seasons. Season 6 is where I started to not love this show as much as I used to. Then Season 7 came, found it a bit rushed. But Season 8 is where I got the most angry towards Game of Thrones. While the pacing in the final season of Game of Thrones is very rushed, the first 2 episodes are fine. They didn't infuriate me as much as the final 4 episodes of Game of Thrones. And now I shall talk about Season 8, Episode 3, The Long Night. The darkest episode in Game of Thrones.
I can't see a thing! Oh no, what a nightmare!
By the way, I am dropping major spoilers in this review, so if you do not want the final season of Game of Thrones spoiled for you, please leave now. If you have already seen the final season of Game of Thrones all the way through, or you don't care about spoilers, here goes. I am aware of how many viewers complained about the lighting of the episode The Long Night. Because of this, I highly advise newcomers, should I find them, to watch this episode purely at nighttime, not during the daytime. And it's because of the way that this episode was lighted in regards to the filming of The Long Night. When I did watch The Long Night at nighttime, from my own experience, I was able to see the screen just fine despite that the episode was really dark. What I struggle to follow is when there's so much shit going on that it's hard to focus on certain characters when all the chaos is happening. And also, it doesn't help that the editing is so choppy in certain scenes that also make it more difficult to follow what the hell is even happening to certain characters. At least the convenient witch Melisandre was there to help light things up, and I never liked Melisandre to begin with. I didn't mind her ambiguity in earlier seasons, but she became such a convenient plot device in later seasons. Remember when Jon Snow was killed at the end of Season 5? Yeah, Melisandre shows up early Season 6 to help resurrect him. I didn't like her at all. And at the end of The Long Night, she served her convenient purpose and she dies. Woohoo! But what infuriated me the most about The Long Night is Arya killing the Night King. In my previous Game of Thrones reviews, I have stated that I did not care for the White Walkers that much. They are essentially the zombies of Game of Thrones, and had they been cut out completely, I don't think it would change the show that much in regards to the other events that happen throughout the entirety of Game of Thrones. But with the way that the White Walkers' arc ends is so anticlimactic and really disappointing given how much build-up the White Walkers have had. Also, where was the build-up with Arya killing the Night King? Because in the last few seasons, there was definitely build-up for Jon Snow and the Night King fighting each other to the death. But no, we never get that. We just get a surprise kill shot by Arya! The final season of Game of Thrones definitely has its moments which are quite emotional, but I don't feel they're earned given how this season is written. This leads me to one of the very few great things about the final season of Game of Thrones. The acting's great, it's consistent with previous seasons, and I commend the cast members for making the best out of how this final season turned out. Throughout its entire run, Game of Thrones has been known for its shock factor, and there's definitely some of that in the final season of Game of Thrones, but the way that these shocking moments are done are executed poorly. And as expected, the final season of Game of Thrones is just as violent as the previous 7 seasons of Game of Thrones. At least that's the one thing about this show that isn't toned down. And the reason I say that is because when I was watching this final season of Game of Thrones, I observed that the sex scenes that occurred in the final season are really toned down compared to the sex scenes in previous seasons. And if you're wondering why I'm making a big deal about sex scenes at this point in Game of Thrones, it is because this is just another addition to how inconsistent Game of Thrones is as a television show as a whole! Could it be that certain cast members didn't want to show their equipment? Or did a bunch of men complain about how the sex scenes objectify women? Well, it doesn't matter now because of how much of a shit show that this final season of Game of Thrones became! Oh, was it Sansa and Ramsay's wedding night that impacted how the sex scenes are depicted in future seasons? Because if that's the case, wow, I can't believe that these showrunners catered to these oversensitive pussies that can't read the fucking context of the setting of Game of Thrones. It's set in medieval times, not 20 fucking 10s. Holy fucking shit! When Game of Thrones began to enter into its last 3 seasons, I did expect the sex scenes to be toned down in quantity with how far the show has gotten and where the show was heading. But if the final season is going to show sex scenes, I wish the scenes were consistent with previous seasons and what they were able to display. Given that this show airs on HBO, which has no limits compared to cable television, which cannot show certain content. Because the way that these sex scenes were executed felt like I was watching a cable-edited version of Game of Thrones. It just didn't feel the same to me. Throughout the entire run of Game of Thrones, there are people out there that have their own favorite characters. If there was one character in Game of Thrones that was my favorite in the entire series, it was Tyrion. Too bad his badassery is gone after Season 4. Although I will give Tyrion this, he did have one badass moment in the final episode. What about Jon Snow, who in fact is Aegon Targaryen, the rightful heir to the Iron Throne? Well, he became Daenerys Targaryen's submissive beta male bitch boy.
My queen. Daenerys is our queen. You are my queen. You are my queen. She is our queen. You will always be my queen. You are my queen. No. And always. All hail the queen. All hail the queen.
What about Cersei Lannister?
I want our baby to live. I want our baby to live. Don't let me die, Jake. Please don't let me die. Please don't let me die. I don't want to die.
What about Jaime Lannister?
Stay with me.
Please.
She's hateful. And so am I. You're a douchebag. You're a douchebag.
What about Daenerys? She got reduced to being a crazy bitch at the end of the series. And don't give me this excuse that she has killed people in the past. There was build-up for her being the Mad Queen. Now that argument would have been valid if the execution of her becoming the Mad Queen was done right. Maybe if the final season had more episodes, Dany becoming the Mad Queen would actually feel organic compared to how fucking worse this final season is! What about Arya? Fuck her kill shot and fuck her plot armor. What about Euron Greyjoy? And now I want to talk about Bran Stark, who ended up ruling the Six Kingdoms at the end of the series. Are these showrunners fucking kidding me? What the fuck did Bran ever do in these last few seasons to earn the right to rule? Oh yeah, because Jon Snow was such a fucking pussy in claiming the right to the throne. Oh, and the Iron Throne ends up getting burned by Drogon. But get this, even Bran Stark didn't want to rule to begin with. And then he says this shit!
Why do you think I came all this way?
So you're telling me I sat through 8 seasons of Game of Thrones to get this piss poor resolution to everything that was built up? Only for all the things built to be shat upon at the end of the series? How did a show like Game of Thrones go from an excellent fantasy show from seasons 1 to 4 and then go downhill in later seasons only to go to shit in the final season? How did this show go the way it did? How? How do you go from great to shit? Tell me! Oh, I know, because they diverted from the source material. Once they ran out of material to adapt, they could not rely on George R.R. Martin's input, and they had to go their own way. And guess what happened? Inconsistency in later seasons. The style of dialogue from earlier seasons is mostly based on George R.R. Martin's writing, does not feel the same in later seasons. The following does not affect my rating of the final season of Game of Thrones, but I do want to talk about this. I'm a little irritated that a couple of cast members, Sophie Turner and Kit Harington in particular, were talking shit towards the fans, given how dissatisfied they were with the final season of Game of Thrones. Sophie Turner pointed out that the petition to remake Season 8 was disrespectful to all the people that worked hard on the final season of Game of Thrones. Which I will commend the crew of the final season of Game of Thrones. They did put a lot of effort into the final season. It's just too bad the writing was shit. As for Kit Harington, he said that Game of Thrones haters can go fuck themselves. Clearly he needs to know how to treat the audience with respect and not treat the audience like morons or treat the audience like shit. I am not heavily criticizing the final season of Game of Thrones because it's a popular thing to do these days. I'm heavily criticizing it because of how it turned out. It greatly ruined many things that were built up from previous seasons. And don't you dare tell me that all art is subjective, like that fucking moron John Campea would say, because I hold my standards quite high. And so what if I'm snobbish sometimes with television, film, and other mediums? I'm just tired of all the bullshit that people suggest and give high praise to when some of them don't deserve that high praise. When I see or hear something great, I tell it like it is, and I really do suggest those particular works. But the problem is, we have the masses that just eat up the bullshit and accept the bullshit. Fuck. I would like to take a few moments to compare Game of Thrones to Avatar: The Last Airbender. Now you might be wondering, why am I comparing the two? Well, they actually have a few things in common. Jon Snow is the rightful heir to the Iron Throne, with his real identity being Aegon Targaryen. Aang is the Avatar and destined to bring balance, as well as defeat the Fire Lord. Aang ends up succeeding in the show's main objective, which was built up throughout 3 seasons, whereas Jon Snow was built up to be this most important character in Game of Thrones, and ends up being reduced to being a beta male who doesn't want to claim the Iron Throne. So much for the build-up. Game of Thrones and Avatar also have this in common.
My stomach is so empty that it's making me tear bend.
Murdered by a boar! The great big hairy whore! He dug in his tusks and dug out my guts, and soon I am no more!
We cannot give up hope.
Save my father!
Truly you should. Killing the man will do you no good.
Save him, please!
Show him mercy. Show the people what a good king should be.
Good people, you may all relax. My father's friend shall be spared this.
Let's forget about the Avatar and get massages.
How could you say that?
He proclaims me Hand of the King. The position's mine for life. And he's given me permission to take Sansa as my wife.
I release a sonic wave from my mouth.
Let's forget about your plight and go rehearse our wedding night.
Cockshot!
Look! It's the Great Divide! The biggest canyon in the Earth Kingdom!
Let's keep flying.
And Avatar The Last Airbender has the edge over Game of Thrones because of how brilliant the play was executed in the show. And lastly, Daenerys and Azula. Both go batshit crazy in the penultimate episodes of their respective shows. Azula going batshit crazy was timed just right. Daenerys going batshit crazy was rushed. Also, Avatar The Last Airbender had a satisfying conclusion, Game of Thrones did not. Therefore, Avatar The Last Airbender is a much better show than Game of Thrones. I would also like to compare Game of Thrones to my favorite television show of all time, Babylon 5, despite the genres are completely different from one another. One's a fantasy, the other's a space opera. Game of Thrones had a rushed final season, Babylon 5 did not. But why Babylon 5 does not have an ideal final season is because what was originally intended for Season 5 got crammed into the second half of Season 4. And the reason for this was because the network, Primetime Entertainment Network, also known as P10 for short, was failing. And Babylon 5 almost ended at Season 4. And that's why the show is the way it is in its final season. It had a rocky start, but the second half of the final season of Babylon 5 made up for it. It also has a great series finale as well, unlike Game of Thrones. Lastly, I want to compare Game of Thrones to one of the greatest anime ever fucking made, Legend of the Galactic Heroes. It has about the same qualities of what made Game of Thrones great before its last few seasons. Except, the major difference is that Legend of the Galactic Heroes has zero bullshit! And all 3 of these titles are greater than Game of Thrones. And when George R.R. Martin does finish A Song of Ice and Fire, which Game of Thrones is based on, there is no way in hell that is going to top J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. Not a chance! Fortunately, the final season of Game of Thrones wasn't riddled with social justice pandering! But regardless, I expected great writing out of Game of Thrones. I got that in the first 4 seasons, but I did not get great writing in the final season of Game of Thrones. What I saw was shit writing. And of course, there are people out there that are crying out about how problematic Game of Thrones is, because in these troubling times that we are living in, it's important to stay woke.
But at the same time, you know, there has been some critique of the works in terms of issues of gender and sexuality and race. So, for example, with the TV series, it even led to the coinage of a new term, sexposition, right, which people talk about it, kind of laugh about the way that sometimes there'll be these scenes with sexual activity or nudity to kind of prevent the information of narrative information from seeming boring, that you have the sex going on. So some people say, okay, so women and sexual minorities are there for just kind of titillation purposes and not much else. And there have also been some critique of some of the racial tropes, for instance, using the trope of the kind of white savior of dark people, like in the case of Daenerys Targaryen. And with I mean, that scene, you know, with Daenerys too, I mean, it ties to the gender issues. I know what you're saying about the differences between the TV show and the book, that it's very different. Let's say the issues of sexual violence that are in the TV program are not like the scene, you know, that is not a rape of Dany in your book.
You have this omniscient, all-knowing, incredible being, and the name that he gets stuck with is Bran the Broken. It's one tiny example of the ways that people think about disability.
This book is written by an old white man. The two showrunners are two white dudes.
My bigger complaint, that scene didn't rub me the wrong way, and that's not, certainly we know that Game of Thrones has had gender issues over its run. The bigger problem, I think, is what Ashley referred to, which is like, you know, it's written by men across the board. The show hasn't had a female writer in years. They haven't had a female director or a person of color.
I have had it with these fucking plebs applying current year politics in a show that is set in medieval times. So don't give me this, oh, Missandei was killed. That is bad representation of women of color and people of color. Arya Stark killed the Night King. Sansa Stark became Queen of the North. What more do you want? And Daenerys didn't get the Iron Throne, and Bran rules the Six Kingdoms? A white male rules the Six Kingdoms! I thought this show was about smashing the patriarchy! And now that David Benioff and D.B. Weiss are doing Game of Thrones, they're gonna move on to Star Wars! Like I give a shit! Fuck Disney Star Wars! And now that I'm done with Game of Thrones, I'm just gonna go revisit Babylon 5, Legend of Galactic Heroes, and Avatar Last Airbender to remedy this fucking piece of shit. Fuck it. Game of Thrones would have been one of the finest television shows that HBO would have had, even if it went past the source material. But given how the final season turned out, we had a great show on our hands over the years, only to go to shit! How sad! When it comes to storytelling, I am drawn to epics. That is why Babylon 5 is my favorite television show. That is why Avatar The Last Airbender is my favorite animated television show. That is why Legend of the Galactic Heroes is my favorite anime. And that is why Lord of the Rings is one of my favorite film trilogies. Game of Thrones would have easily been one of my favorite shows of all time if the quality was great from start to finish. But apparently, David Benioff and D.B. Weiss kind of forgot about quality control. Game of Thrones had a great takeoff, but as it was dropping altitude, it spiraled and crash landed. And I strongly recommend Avatar The Last Airbender, Babylon 5, and Legend of the Galactic Heroes if you have not seen any of those following series. Especially if you were disappointed by the final season of Game of Thrones. It is truly a shame that what was once a great television show declined in quality only to end in epic failure. I'm going to be shooting a 3.5 out of 10 for Game of Thrones Season 8. And as for my overall rating of Game of Thrones, you know, I need to think about that. I think a re-evaluation of Game of Thrones is in order, especially with how this show ended. And I'm done talking about Game of Thrones. I'm finally done. Now I can move on to perhaps finer things regarding HBO. 2 shows I have heard nothing but praise. The Sopranos and The Wire. I'm actually kind of curious how those 2 play out. I'm already convinced that those 2 shows are better than Game of Thrones, despite not having seen The Sopranos all the way through, and not even seen a single episode of The Wire. And that ends my review of Game of Thrones Season 8. I'll be reloading for my next review, so until then, I'll see you later. And now, my watch of Game of Thrones has truly ended.
Leaf Village Secret Finger Jutsu!